I mean, look how like golden that is. But I've actually been making this bread since I was in college. These are ready to go in the oven. Okay, yeah. That was the best. But I feel like the most important factor is, of course, how it tastes. So, hey you guys, welcome back to my kitchen. And if you are new here, welcome to See Mindy Mom. I'm Mindy. Today we are going to make beer bread 4 different ways and see if we can discover the best method. So stay tuned. All right, you guys, if you do not know what beer bread is, you need to. It is a really easy, quick bread that does not require yeast, and it has very simple ingredients. Self-rising flour, a little bit of sugar, a 12-ounce can of beer, and sometimes some butter. You just mix all of the ingredients together and pour it into a baking dish and bake it, and you don't have to do any kneading. It doesn't have to rise. Like I said, it's just a quick bread, so it's really easy for something you want to throw together to go along with a dish. It goes great with soups and chilies. It also makes really great toast the next day, so it's something that we have, fairly frequently around here. Today, we are going on our 5th consecutive day of sub-freezing temperatures, and we have probably at least a week left with some pretty big snow chances on the way, so I thought it would be a great day to be in the kitchen baking. You might hear the little ones around making a little bit of noise, but that's okay. That's just the life that we live. This is real life. So what makes beer bread work is the beer, obviously, right? And one of the cool things about it is that you can change up the flavor of your bread depending on the kind of beer that you use. So a more stout beer like a Guinness or a brown ale like Newcastle will give, those stronger beer flavors to the bread. A sweeter beer like maybe a Blue Moon or a Leinenkugel will lend some sweetness to the bread. For today's purposes, I'm just going to use my regular house Pilsner, which is typically Miller Lite or Coors Light, and Miller Lite is what we have on hand. This will not lend a ton of flavor to the bread because it's a very mild flavor in general, but it's a different ingredient that I want to test out today. A lot of beer recipes call for self-rising flour, but self-rising flour is just regular all-purpose flour that already has baking powder and salt in it. So if you Google how to make self-rising flour, I have found that it is just 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder and a 1/4 teaspoon of salt for every 1 cup of all-purpose flour that you are using in your recipe. I do have some self-rising flour on hand, so we're going to be using that today, but I am going to make 1 loaf of beer bread using that method of making self-rising flour from all-purpose flour, baking powder, and salt. Pretty much all of the beer bread recipes that I find also call for sugar. I used to leave it out, but I found that adding sugar, even just a little bit to this bread recipe, not only contributes to the flavor, it changes the texture of the bread slightly, and that could be because sugar can play a part in the chemical reactions and the, sciencey stuff that is happening while the bread is baking. But I thought about doing a video where I bake several loaves of bread and change the amounts or the kinds of sweeteners that I'm using. So if you like this video and you're interested in seeing another comparison video with beer bread, be sure to leave me a comment and let me know. But the ingredient that I really wanted to test out today and that has given me trouble in beer bread before is butter. Lots of beer bread recipes call for butter. In fact, the standard beer bread recipe that we're going to use today, the one that I see the most often, is 3 cups of self-rising flour, a 1/4 cup of sugar, 1 12-ounce beer, and anywhere from half to a full stick of butter, or a 1/4 cup to half a cup of butter. We're going to use a 1/4 cup of butter for today's purposes because I've tried it with half a cup and it's just way too much. The bread did not come out right. But I've actually been making this bread since I was in college, and when I made it back then, I never put butter in it. So we're going to test that out today. So for this little experiment, I'm going to make 4 loaves of beer bread, but I'm going to change up the way that I'm making each one so we can see which one turns out the best. We're going to make 1 with just self-rising flour, sugar, and beer. We're going to make 1 with self-rising flour, sugar, beer, and a 1/4 cup of melted butter over the top. I'm going to make 1 with the other flour mixture, making my self-rising flour myself from all-purpose flour, baking powder, and salt. And just for fun, I'm going to put 1 in the bread maker as well because first of all, I want to see how my bread maker does on the quick bread setting, and secondly, I know because of the way the bread maker mixes ingredients that it will actually incorporate the butter into the bread instead of putting it across the top. I already have my ovens preheating to 375. That's a little bit higher than the standard 350, just note. So let's get started mixing the breads together and then we'll bake them and see what we come up with. So we're going to start with the standard beer bread recipe minus the butter, and it calls for 3 cups of sifted self-rising flour. I have already sifted my flour here. It's sitting in this bowl next to me, so I'm just going to put in 3 cups. A 1/4 cup of sugar. I'm going to mix that together just a little bit. and 1 12-ounce beer. And then I'm just gonna stir that all together. Most of the recipes that I read do not recommend using an electric mixer. You don't want to over mix this dough. You actually want it to be a little bit lumpy whenever it goes into the pan. That's why it's gonna be interesting to see how the bread maker does. I have already greased my loaf pan, and I'm actually using a smaller loaf pan. It's an 8.5 by 4.5 loaf pan instead of a 9 by 5. I've made it in a 9 by 5. I feel like it really just changes the cooking time. And I'm just gonna kind of smooth that into the pan and make sure it's pretty evenly spread around the loaf pan. And there's my first loaf ready to go in the oven. Now this loaf I have made exactly like the first one, with the self-rising flour, the sugar, and the beer. The only difference is that I'm going to pour half a stick or a 1/4 cup of melted butter over the top of it, and then it will be ready to go in the oven as well. Now this loaf I am making exactly like the first loaf, except I'm making my self-rising flour by using 3 cups of sifted all-purpose flour, 4.5 teaspoons of baking powder, and 1/2 teaspoon or 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt. Then I'm just adding my sugar, whisk that all together, and my beer so we can see if it works by making our own self-rising flour as opposed to buying the self-rising flour already made up. These are ready to go in the oven, and already I think it's so interesting that this one that I made with the self-rising flour and this one that I made with the all-purpose flour plus baking powder and salt, look at the difference in how fluffy those are. And these only sat on the counter for maybe 5 minutes while I mixed this one together. So I don't know if it's just the reaction is happening faster or what, but this one already seems like it's gonna bake up a little fluffier. And I have 1 loaf ready to go in the bread maker. I have put the ingredients in according to the instructions from my bread maker. So all the liquids are on the bottom, the beer and the butter, which I did not melt. I just cut it into cubes, so it's still a 1/4 cup or 1/2 stick of butter. I also put the sugar on the bottom so it could start kind of mixing with the beer. And then I have 3 cups of my sifted self-rising flour. I'm gonna pop this into my bread maker and I'm gonna set it on the quick bread setting. And I have to say, I don't have high hopes for this because I feel like it's going to overmix the bread, but again, it'll be an interesting experience just to find out. Okay, so this is after 35 minutes, and these are the 2 loaves that don't have butter. Look, that's the one that I made with the all-purpose flour. That's the one with the self-rising flour. This one's like all bumpy. Maybe I didn't mix it well enough. And then this one down here is the one with the butter. And here's the problem I run into all the time. They look done right now, but they really aren't done. If I take them out right now, they're gonna be like too gooey in the middle. So I'm gonna leave them in for 10 more minutes and check on them. Okay, so I took these out after 50 minutes in the oven. This is the one that I made from all-purpose flour plus baking powder and salt. So I made my self-rising flour with that one. This is the one that I made with self-rising flour, sugar, and beer, but no butter. And then this is the one that I poured the melted butter over the top of. So we're gonna let those cool, and then the one from the bread maker is still cooking. And here is the bread maker version. I'm actually surprised it rose so well. I'm kind of interested to get this out and see what it looks like. Okay, pardon the mess because I just took this out of the pan, the bread pan, but I actually think this is undercooked, you guys. It doesn't look like it's cooked all the way through. And when I turn it over and I see where the paddle was, see how it looks kind of doughy in there still? I'm gonna pop this onto a cookie sheet actually and put it in the oven for about 10 or 15 minutes because I don't think it's done cooking. So I'm just going to call it, you guys, and say that the loaf from the bread maker did not work out. It didn't cook all the way through. It did not cook evenly. It's not the same texture, and I don't even care for the taste that much. There are some beer bread machine recipes out there, but the ones I found on Pinterest were actually a form of yeast bread where you still used yeast and you just used beer as one of the flavorings, as one of the liquids in it. But the traditional beer bread recipe, even on the quick bread setting on my bread machine maker, I just don't think that it worked well. So I don't recommend that at all. But it was a fun experiment. Okay, so here are my 3 loaves that I baked in the oven with variations of just the traditional beer bread recipe. This is the regular beer bread recipe with the butter. This is a regular beer bread recipe without the butter. And then here is the loaf where I made my own self-rising flour by using all-purpose flour and adding baking powder and salt. And as you can see, it's definitely like a little lumpier. It's not even quite as tall as the other loaf. I feel like this loaf rose a little bit better, and the only difference between these two loaves is that this one had the all-purpose flour plus baking powder and salt, and this one I just started with regular self-rising flour. And if you're wondering why there is a chunk missing from this bread, it's because one of my children walked by while these were cooling and decided that she couldn't wait until I was done filming, and she helped herself to a little piece of the beer bread. So we're gonna say real life with kids in the house. Now I can just tell you that obviously by looking at these, this one looks the best, right? I mean, look how like golden that is. And even for it being kind of bumpy on the top, it's still a little bit soft on the bottom, I can feel. But we're gonna go ahead and slice these and see how they look on the inside and maybe even take a little taste. This is the loaf that I used the all-purpose flour and then added the stuff to it to make it like self-rising flour. So these are completely cooled and it's sliced pretty easy. Looks like that on the inside. So not bad. Just to compare, here's the one where I used just the store-bought self-rising flour. It was a little easier to slice just now, actually, once I got on the inside. Here's that. So here's these two side by side. This is the making the self-rising flour ourselves, and this is using flour that's already self-rising from the store. You can even see a difference in sort of the size of the loaf, if you ask me. And this one feels and looks just a little bit more dense than this one. This one got just a little bit fluffier, which makes sense when you think about how they looked before I put them in the oven. And then here is the one where I poured the butter on top before I baked it. So you can kind of hear as I'm slicing it, it's got kind of a crustier top, right? The crust is a little bit more firm. But here's what it looks like on the inside. It's sliced pretty easily. And here's what it looks like when everything is exactly the same, except this one had butter and this one didn't. So again, it's kind of interesting to see that this one looks bigger. It looks like the butter kind of made it fluffier, even though you'd think it would make it denser, but there you have it, side by side. And here it is compared to the loaf where we made our own self-rising flour from all-purpose flour. So I just tried slicing this loaf where we made the self-rising flour from all-purpose, and as you can see, it kind of fell apart here on the top. It's just a little bit harder to slice. As opposed to this one, which was a little easier to slice. This is the one where we put the butter on top, and even though it has a crispier crust, it was really easy to slice, and man, it is really soft on the inside. But I feel like the most important factor is, of course, how it tastes. So let me tell you what I think about that. Okay, so this is the loaf with homemade self-rising flour from all-purpose and no butter on top. Okay, yeah, I mean, it's a very mild taste. I normally eat this with butter on it. You know, I spread a little butter on it or maybe turn it into garlic toast, spread some butter and sprinkle some garlic salt on it. So it's just a very mild flavor. You definitely can taste a little bit of the beer in there. Texture-wise, the inside is soft and then it's got kind of a nice crispy crust, so it's okay. This is the same thing, but made with already prepared self-rising flour. So this is the one where the self-rising flour was already self-rising flour. We didn't have to turn it into self-rising flour, but we didn't put any butter on top of it. I think this is very similar to the other one where we made our self-rising flour. I would say that it's probably just slightly different in texture. I would say that it's actually a little bit different in taste. The taste is slightly different. I feel like there may be more salt in this self-rising flour than I put in our homemade version, and maybe that's why it has more of a taste to me than the other one does. And then this is the one where we made it the standard recipe way, where you actually pour the melted butter on top before you bake it. Okay, yeah. That one's the best. That one's the best. Okay, so definitely for flavor, I feel like this one is the clear winner. And you would think that the inside would taste just like the others, but it doesn't. It tastes better to me. I don't know, some of the butter seeped down into the bread and helped flavor it. I mean, it's just a little bit of butter. A quarter cup of butter is 4 tablespoons, and across an entire loaf, you wouldn't think that makes a difference, but it did. And just look at how like good that crust looks all the way on the bottom, all the way around the top. It's really fluffy on the inside. It has that crunchy crust. Yeah, for me, this is the winner right here. All right, you guys, so my verdict is that the traditional standard beer bread recipe made the traditional way is the best. And that is 3 cups of self-rising flour, a 1/4 cup of sugar, 1 12-ounce beer, and then a 1/4 cup or half a stick of butter melted, poured over the top, and baked in the oven at 375 in a regular loaf pan. I feel like that came out the best. I like the taste. I like the texture of it. It's gonna make yummy toast to go along with the soup that I have going in the crock pot behind me. So that's just my opinion. Of course, you can try out some different ways of making it and see what you prefer, but that's the results of my experiment according to my preferences. Beer bread can also be a great base for making your own kind of bread according to your taste. I've seen recipes where they add cheese to it or where they add garlic and herbs to it. I've even seen some recipes where they turn them into like sweeter breads and use, like a seasonal beer, like a pumpkin beer in the fall, and then turn it into a pumpkin bread. But the basic recipe I think works the best if you're just going for like a standard easy bread that you can throw together really quickly and that will go along with lots of different meals that you might be making already. So thank you so much for watching, and I will be sure to check in with another video very soon.